Lancashire isn't exactly renowned for its literary associations, but that's not our fault. It really ought to be up there in great big letters for producing some of the most famous authors in history. The trouble is, people are generally ignorant of our abundant, if not slightly obfuscated literary inheritance, including many Lancastrians themselves. We are the forgotten county, after all. The truth is, Lancashire excels, and always has done, at magnum opuses of imaginative escapism, where a thinly veiled version of the county ends up as backdrop to some of the greatest fantasies ever penned, from Titus Crone to The Lord of the Rings. And no, before anybody goes there in the comments boxes, Dante's Inferno wasn't based in Fleetwood. However, for example, did you know that Thomas the Tank Engine was set in Lancashire? Well, just off the Lancashire coast, anyhow, on the fictional island of Sodor. The story goes that when holidaying on the Isle of Man, the Reverend Wilbert Audrey, Thomas the Tank Engine's creator, discovered that the local bishop there bore the title of Bishop of Sodor and Man. Apparently, the Reverend liked the name a lot, and because kids were always asking him where the stories took place, he invented the fictional island of Sodor to prevent any protracted embarrassing silences during his response, placing it firmly between the Isle of Man and Walney Island. He even drew a map connecting the train tracks to the mainland at Barrow. While we're in this neck of the woods, Arthur Ransom's Swallows and Amazons was, of course, set in and around Coniston Water. People often think that it was set on the next lake up at Windermere, but it wasn't. And if anybody wants a punch-up about it, I'll be in the bike sheds at 4 o'clock. Swallows and Amazons follows the somewhat protracted and inconsequential adventures of two families of school children and their wooden sailing dinghies in the 1930s, where health and safety obviously wasn't considered an issue. Presumably because the kids were so desperately middle-class and boring, they never did anything even remotely dangerous anyhow. As children, my brother and me rowed across to Wildcat Island on more than one occasion, little realising that we were following in such illustrious footsteps, or possibly oar-strokes. The only Arthur Ransom book I'd read at the time was Peter Duck, which, although it featured the Swallows and Amazons, was an altogether more exotic, adventurous affair set on the high seas, with the occasional racist remark thrown in for good measure. On the other side of Coniston Water is the village of Nearsaury, one-time home of Beatrix Potter. Beatrix was actually cremated at Carlton, because it was the nearest crematorium to Hilltop, and that was how she wanted to go. For some reason, Beatrix Potter is particularly resonant with Japanese tourists, though God only knows why. Presumably it's their equivalent of our obsession with manga or something. A bit further south, at Lancaster to be exact, anybody familiar with Mervyn Peake's Titus Crone trilogy will instantly recognise the castle and its surrounding town as being the inspiration behind Gormenghast. Peake enlisted as a war artist at the outbreak of the Second World War. In 1943 he was posted to Blackpool, where the full horrors of conflict no doubt coloured his nightmarish vision for the rest of his life. He took up residence on Coronation Street, creating signs for the officers-only toilets. Well, it was war art after a fashion. He wrote most of Titus Crone on the end of North Pier, which explains a lot, almost certainly basing Gormenghast on Lancaster Castle. Further south still, we come to Stonyhurst College at Clitheroe, where we encounter possibly the most famous fantasy writer that Britain's ever produced, next to Katie Hopkins. j.r.r. Tolkien wrote a sizable portion of his famous trilogy there when he was visiting his son John between 1941 and 1944. There's even a Tolkien trail for the more literary-minded rambler, detailing some of the places and names familiar with those who have studied the Hobbit's journey out of the Shire. On a side note, earlier in its history, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle had been a student at Stonyhurst. Apparently, he based the characters of Sherlock Holmes and Professor Moriarty on fellow students. We probably shouldn't forget John Cunliffe either, the author of such childhood favourites as Rosie and Jim and Postman Pat. He also attended Stonyhurst College. Alright, we're probably scraping the bottom of the proverbial barrel a bit now, but I bet you'll be humming at least one of those annoying theme songs for the rest of the day. Anyhow, the Shire isn't New Zealand at all, but is actually Lancashire. And Mordor's probably Yorkshire, which would make perfect sense. Speaking of the dark hinterland of Lancashire's easternmost boundary, Wycombe Hall, situated dangerously close to the Yorkshire border, was the inspiration for Charlotte Bronte's Ferndean Manor, as mentioned in her novel j.r.r. Another Lancashire location associated with the same book was Cowan Bridge near Kirby Lonsdale. The infamous Lowood institution featured in the novel was based on the clergyman's daughter's school there, which the Bronte sisters attended from 1824, and the brutality of which Charlotte later claimed was responsible for the early deaths of her sisters Maria and Elizabeth. Probably not Lancashire's finest hour. Let's move quickly onwards. We could mention Jessica Lofthouse and Alfred Wainwright, both of whom hailed from Blackburn. We could talk about Alistair Cook with his Letters from America, who went to Blackpool Grammar School, or Edmund Spenser, author of The Fairy Queen, who came from Hurstwood, or Wilfred Owen, the famous war poet, stationed in Fleetwood before being sent to his death on the front, or John Osborne, who wrote Look Back in Anger on Morecambe Pier. Well, it had to be written somewhere. Or Leslie Charteris, the creator of The Saint, who went to Rossall School. Or Elizabeth Gaskell, who penned most of her works at Silverdale. And I completely forgot to mention Sir Terry Pratchett. Anyhow, I could mention them, but I won't. It's almost tea time, and I'm getting hungry. So, as always, please click like, and if you haven't done so already, please subscribe. And all being well, the weather might have improved next week, and we might get some proper footage for once.